Well, I originally said I didn't want to do this, because I don't think I know every class well enough to give an accurate judgment on it. But right now, if you search for a tier list, what you'll find is this data from 1.74, which shows the win rates on insane difficulty. And while this data is interesting to look at, I don't think it's the best for judging the power of classes, or at least once you get out of the top 10 classes, there are some really good ones down at the bottom. So I think what the data shows is how easy it is to succeed on some of these classes, but not necessarily how powerful they are. So I think I can do a better job. It definitely won't be perfect, but I'll point out different talents on each class which I think make it powerful. And if I'm wrong and call your favorite class garbage, you can laugh at me in the comments, so hey, everybody wins. For the tiers, there is no F tier, because that usually means something is not viable and you shouldn't use it or play it, which in the case of classes in Tome, all the classes are more than capable of beating the game. Which brings me to my next point. I will be talking about it from the perspective of insane roguelike, but most of this should apply to the lower difficulties as well. And lastly, just because you'll see a class in one of the lower tiers, it doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't play it, as some of the weaker classes are some of my favorites, because they really force you to use every tool at your disposal to survive. But this is definitely not true for all the weak classes, and we start with Alchemist. This is a class that has a permanent summon in the form of a golem, which is a really good combatant for the first few tier 1 dungeons. After that, it starts to die really quickly, and it's so bad that one of the popular strategies is to just park your golem at the entrance to the current floor, just so you can use Golem Portal to get out of any trouble. So if that's the use for one of the main mechanics of the class, it doesn't bode well for the Alchemist. And by itself, the class throws bombs, which are small AoE range 10 talents. You can pick out of a few elements, and then you just throw bombs for the rest of the game. It's not particularly powerful, and maybe the worst part is that I think this might be the most boring class in the game. And while this tier list is mainly about the power of these classes, if a class is boring, this actually affects its power. Because if you are bored, you will be playing recklessly, you will make mistakes, the game is very long, and eventually you will get punished for it. So for all these reasons together, I think Alchemist is a D tier class. And it's a shame it's one of the default ones, because it sounds awesome, and I think it's the first experience of many players in Tome, but it's not great. Annihilator is one of the Tinker classes from the Embers of Rage DLC, and all these classes have access to Tinkers, which are incredibly powerful, slightly overpowered bonuses you can just put on your gear that are basically free. They cost you some generic points, but the power you get from them is ridiculous. So none of the Tinker classes can really be that bad. And while I've not played this class much, it is pretty clear that it's powerful defensively, with talents like Reactive Armor and Exoskeleton. It then also has Hypervision Goggles, which is just better track. And the offense of this class is like a mix between Alchemist and Summoner. You can summon turrets or get a permanent summon through the Mecha Arachnid tree. And unlike the Golem, this summon is supposed to be actually very powerful. So clearly, again, this class very good defensively. And if any of the offensive options work, which I'm sure they do, it is very good. I'm going to put it into A tier, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if it belongs in the S tier. Anorithil is the first example of a series of classes that have very bad early games, but scale quite well into the late game. And I'm struggling to decide if that kind of class belongs at the bottom of B tier or the top of C tier. Anorithil is one of the most impressive classes visually because of the circles tree, which are instant speed, huge AoEs that you drop at the beginning of each fight, and they give you powerful bonuses like making you immune to silence, while damaging and debuffing enemies. For example, pushing them back so it's hard for any melee to reach you. But this class really struggles with damage in the early game. It has some crit synergy, which obviously doesn't do much for the first, let's say, 25 levels. And there is another kind of hidden downside. Anorithil and Sun Paladin are both part of the good aligned faction in Tome, which means they cannot side with the Assassin Lord, which means they don't get access to the Font of Sacrifice once they come back from the east, which is a pretty big power loss. Going back to saving the merchant and getting random orange items is just really pathetically weak compared to the Font of Sacrifice. So I will put Anorithil at the top of the C tier. I think it can get pretty powerful in the late game, but it is quite difficult to get it there. Arcane Blade is one of the classes that made me want to make this tier list. In the insane win rate data, Arcane Blade is below classes like Alchemist, Shadowblade, or Vermic, which I think is completely unacceptable, because Arcane Blade has one of the highest damage potentials in the entire game. And while it doesn't do much defensively, as the saying goes, offense is the best defense. When you one-shot most of your enemies, that's good enough. The class is all about arcane combat. You pick one out of a few spells, pick lightning, and then you walk up to enemies, flurry, shoot 20 lightnings, and they die. The reason why I think this class is so low on the win rate is that people try to play it melee right from level 1, which I think is a bad idea, because to really make Arcane Blade pop off, you need some levels, you need points in some of these talents, you struggle with stats in the early game, and you need a later talent to fix that. So I think until the first Prodigy, you should just play this as an Archmage, using lightning and chain lightning to clear enemies, and that's perfectly fine and a pretty comfortable early game. After that, Arcane Blade becomes, without a doubt, one of the best classes in the game. So I honestly thought about putting it into S tier, but for the slightly weaker early game, I'll put it on the top of A. Definitely not the easiest class to play though. Archer is a ranged weapon class. You get to pick out of using slings or bows, each one with its own unique tree, and it's just really solid. It maintains a decent power level throughout the whole game. You get access to combat techniques and blinding speed, and the incredible powerful mobility tree with trained reactions and tumble, which is honestly kind of all you need in terms of defenses for a class that will be eventually shooting enemies from 10 range. But you even get the reflexes tree that lets you sometimes take 0 damage from projectiles and melee attacks, which is really similar to Skirmisher, although Archer just ends up feeling weaker. You get a lot more buttons to press and more utility, with a silence and slow and some more AoE options, but it's hard to beat the flatter damage reduction of Skirmisher. So Archer, I think, is a perfect example of a B tier class, as it's just pretty good for most of the game. Archmage is a difficult class to rate because there are so many options for how to build it, and some of them will have very different power levels, and then there are also 2 class evolutions which pretty drastically change how the class is played. But in general, I think Archmage is just very good. Every build will get access to Temporal Shield, Phantasmal Shield and Stonewall, which are very powerful defensive options, and then you simply blast enemies with an element of your choosing from really long range, and then you even have like Displacement Shield, and all your shields are stronger. So I think Archmage firmly belongs in the A tier. I think it is a deceptively difficult class to play, because there are so many options, it's easy to get lost. I remember I tried to take all the powerful sustains when I was newer, which seemed like a really good idea, but it doesn't work out very well, and the character ended up being pretty useless, so don't try that. Berserker is the starter melee weapon class, and for that reason it is very simple. You jump into melee and hit pretty hard, and that's about it. Berserker can ignore death for a while, but that is a very dangerous talent to use because usually when you get low, you want to run away. Staying and using all your resources to fight is all great until you misjudge the situation one time and now you can't run away because you used your movement infusion to close the gap and you just dead. So fairly easy to play, but not particularly powerful out of the melee weapon classes, and also a bit boring, so I'll put it into D tier. It could go at the bottom of C, but I'll put it into D. It definitely deserves to be above Alchemist, but not by much. Now Brawler, that is more of what I want from a weapon class. Although it doesn't use weapons, it just uses fists, but more or less it's the same. And it gets flat damage reduction, just for existing. This helps a little bit, but this class is still very much a glass cannon. A lot of its talents rely on a combo point system, which can either give you big attacks or a huge burst of defense, depending on what you need. You can also grapple enemies, which totally disables them, eventually even silencing them. So this is a fun, powerful melee class. I've not gotten it to the end game yet, but I think it should do quite well. So I'll put it into B. Another argument for why I think this class is pretty good is because the AI, when it plays Brawler, it basically completely ignores the combo points. It uses its talents when it has 0 combo points and the talents literally don't do anything. And despite that, standing next to Brawlers is still pretty scary. So when the AI is dangerous on a class, that's usually a sign it will be pretty good in the hands of the player. Bulwark is the second starter weapon class, and this one uses a shield, which would make you think it is the tank class, whereas Berserker is the damage class. Well, that's not exactly how it plays out. Bulwark has access to greater weapon focus, which is a pretty insane talent that just gives you extra attacks. So it ends up doing decent damage while still having talents like Shield Wall to make it decently tanky. Easy to play, but not much going on. And it's been a while since I played Bulwark, but I'll put it into C tier. That feels about right. Corruptor is the evil Archmage, focusing on blight damage, and it is weak early game and quite powerful late game. It has access to Bone Shield, which is an incredibly powerful defensive sustain, and offensively, the defining boss killer talent is Corrosive Worm, which ideally explodes for massive damage and finishes off any tough enemy. You also get Curse of Vulnerability, so Corruptor has a pretty easy time getting through resistances, and Reduce means you can get resistances to negatives, so this is just a damage boost against any kind of enemy. This coupled with talents like Dark Ritual, which give you a lot of crit multi, means you can reach some insane damage numbers on Corruptor in the late game. But again, it's all about getting there, which I think is a little easier than Anorithil. So it's either bottom of B or top of C. I'll put it at the top of C for now. Cultist of Entropy. Now, here's another weak early, monstrously powerful late game class. But this one also has a summon, the Herald of Oblivion, which is one of the most powerful summons in the game. And definitely one of the coolest, because you don't just click a button and summon him, you need to apply 6 magical debuffs to an enemy before he pops out and annihilates everything. So this makes for a pretty unique playstyle. Cultist of Entropy also has a lot of talents that make it stronger and the enemy weaker the longer the fight goes on. And once this all comes together late game, this class is one of the best. I would say S tier definitely. But the early game is where all your points are spread out, and it is very tough to survive the tier 2 dungeons. You have Void Stars as your main defensive talent, and while it is very good, it is not enough to keep you safe while you are trying to stack 6 magical debuffs on some rogue unique trying to one-shot you. So I really like this class, it's a lot of fun, but I think it belongs with these similar classes into C tier. I'll put it at the top though, just because it's the coolest. Cursed is what you play if you want to play Berserker and you have some experience in the game already. It's pretty beefy, it jumps into melee, and hits really hard. On top of that, it's also a willpower class, and you get an aura around you that can stun and slow enemies over time. And also the more you hit a single enemy, the more bonuses you get through Stalk. And Cursed even has the Rampage tree, which I think fulfills the fantasy of a Berserker Rage better than the talents that Berserker has. So I think this class is a lot more fun. But it is fairly one-dimensional and not actually that tanky, so for those reasons I think it's around C tier. I'll put it above Bulwark. Demonologist is a sword and shield class that has tinkers, kind of. They are not called tinkers, they're instead called demon seeds, and you get these demon seeds just by killing enemies, and throughout the game you get stronger and stronger versions with more and more powerful effects, and a lot of these are even active abilities that can change the way your character is played. So there are a ton of builds you can do on Demonologist, but the class is predisposed to be very tanky and having its block up almost permanently, especially if you go something like Drem. You can use Shield Slam and Demonic Madness and your block button itself to block for like 10 turns of combat if you also take the Eternal Guard Prodigy, which you should. And blocking is not only good because it makes you harder to kill, you have talents like Blighted Shield and Shattered Mind to debuff enemies, and you get Osmosis Shield as a defensive sustain, which is one of the best defensive sustains in the game. It's a little confusing to read and understand, but basically it just keeps healing you as you take damage, you keep healing more and more, and it's extremely powerful and it scales from your shield block value. And you can even go for talents like Dark Rain, which could potentially give you up to 40% all damage affinity. So if you want to play a tank in Tome, I think Demonologist is one of the best classes to fulfill that fantasy. And offensively, it's nothing too special, but I think it's partly because the way I built the character, I don't think maximized the potential of the class. I went just for a demon seed that converted my damage to acid and gave me some armor penetration. There are probably stronger options, so I want to put this class in A tier or the top of B tier. And because I put Arcane Blade into A, I don't think I can put Demonologist in the same tier, so I'll put it on the top of B. But this class is pretty great. Doombringer is Berserker infused with demonic strength, and it forgoes the ability to not die for the ability to die very quickly, but to deal even more damage. Reckless Strike might be the talent that encapsulates this class the best, hitting for insane damage while ignoring armor and resistances, although you take some of the damage yourself. Even the names of the talents are aggressive, like Obliterating Smash, Detonating Charge, and Destroyer as your big enabler you press at the start of combat, turning you into a demon and giving you some extra effects on your abilities. But while damage is good, and this class is terrifying in the hands of the AI, because if the rare casts Reckless Strike and almost kills itself, it doesn't care. There's 1,000 more rares waiting for you. But if you cast this and almost kill yourself, that's a big problem. So I've only dabbled in this class, I don't have too much experience, but it seems pretty difficult to play and it doesn't seem the damage is high enough to make up for the lack of defense. Although you shouldn't look at the order of these classes too much, I think they're all fairly similar. Doomed is a summoner, but you don't control the summons. They have a mind of their own, and sometimes they will just fly by your enemies and not do much. Although eventually, once you unlock Advanced Shadowmancy, you get some talents to directly control your shadows. They are quite hard to kill by direct damage because they have an ability to ignore damage, kind of flicker out of existence for a bit, and the damage they deal is pretty high. I basically only relied on the shadows to deal damage, only casting some mind damage talents from the back, and they carried me through the game. The big downside is damage over time, which can kill the shadows really quickly, and you get an ability to resummon them once, but if there's like a fire AoE all over the screen, they'll die again very quickly, and then Doomed is pretty weak. Unless you build it as more of a weapon class with Psyblades, which the class has some support for. You get the Gestures tree, which gives you some bonuses, but from what I've seen, people usually end up going Psyblades anyways, and with the help of Force of Will talents, you can play quite close range and deal a lot of damage with the super boosted critical multiplier. So Doomed, I would put at the bottom of B. It's a solid, unique class. Gunslinger is a ranged weapon class. It uses guns instead of bows or slings, but for the most part the biggest difference is that it makes a different sound when you fire the weapon. I've played it a decent amount in the second campaign, and I didn't enjoy it. It is pretty straightforward. It's a lot of just basic attacking and shooting. You can upgrade your bullets, like for example supercharged bullets, which gives you AoE, kind of, and a lot of armor penetration. There are a few funny talents like Awesome Toss, which disarms you because you throw your guns in the air to randomly shoot at enemies. And this talent is actually really good because it does good damage and lets you reload. And for defense you get Automated Cloak Tessellation, which gives you quite a lot of flat damage reduction and a high chance to deflect projectiles. And obviously you get Tinkers on top of this. So the class is good, but I personally found it a bit boring. I'd much rather play Archer, just so I have a few more buttons to press. So I'll put it into B, although if you really enjoy that playstyle and you are capable of staying focused, you could probably put it into A tier also. Marauder is a combination of Berserker and Rogue. It gets greater weapon focus and a lot better damage supporting talents than Bulwark. So if you get this class to the late game, you will be obliterating enemies. The unique Marauder tree is Thuggery, which gives you crit multi, armor pen, attack speed, crit chance, physical penetration, just all good stuff. Then you borrow the Unstoppable talent from Berserker, so that you don't die. And you also have the mobility tree with tumble and trade reactions. So this is another variety of the, if you want to play Berserker, play this class instead. But I would guess this class doesn't do too well in the early game, so around the B tier feels right for it. So I am re-recording this part about Mindslayer because originally I said some nonsense. Mindslayer is a weapon class that not only wields weapons, but then it also telekinetically has a floating weapon next to them that it also uses to attack. And basically all of its trees are entirely unique to it, and I have not played it yet. But despite that, I feel pretty confident this class is quite good. For example, it has a better blinding speed hidden in its generic talents, not even a class talent. This talent is pretty nuts. Then it has access to quite a lot of defense through these shields that eventually turn into a psionic shield. And I know these are good because this is how the AI Mindslayers are really hard to kill. And then there's just a bunch of talents that are better versions of already good talents. So like Telekinetic Smash is Stunning Blow, but better because it hits with the main hand weapon and the telekinetically wielded weapon. You get a bunch of free stats through talents like Augmentation, and then you can choose out of a few options for how to focus your telekinesis with talents like this one that boost your damage and penetration and give you all kinds of bonuses, while also giving you defensive talents like Deflect Projectiles with a 40% chance to deflect projectiles, and you can even use them and throw them at your enemies. And Implode is one of the really dangerous talents that you always need to cleanse when fighting against AI Mindslayers. and I imagine this will be really good. Getting a 50% slow is extremely powerful. And for a class that looks pretty complicated, Mindslayer is doing quite well in the insane win rate data. So for all these reasons, I am going to put it into A. And I wouldn't even be surprised if this was an S tier class. And you might be wondering, are there going to be any classes in S tier? We are halfway done and still no S tier classes. Well, it's good that you're asking, because here we go. Necromancer is exactly what you would expect. You can play it as a summoner with skeletons and ghouls, or just as a kind of Archmage with darkness and cold magic. It then also has a unique prodigy where you turn into a Lich, which makes you immune to basically every debuff in the game, gives you a ton of stats, 60% chance to ignore critical hits, and even an extra generic tree with some really disgustingly powerful talents like Frightening Presence. So Necromancer, and I think especially the caster version, although the summoner is good also, is firmly in the S tier. Once you get to the Lich form, you are very likely to beat the game and enjoy perhaps the best mage class in the game, or almost the best. Oozemancer is a mind power nature themed class, and its defining feature is that it's absolutely impossible to kill. If you've played the game for any amount of time, you will know Oozeemancers, because fighting one is always difficult, especially if combined with another good class. And like I've mentioned a few times, if that's how good it is in the hands of the AI, you can only imagine how powerful it is in the hands of the player. They are so tanky because when they take damage, they create oozes, and every ooze shares damage with the Oozemancer. But the oozes are also incredibly tanky, so you can't just kill them. And then there is also poison everywhere, so you can't stand next to them. But you can't kill the Oozemancer unless you kill the oozes, and you are slowly dying because you've cleansed the poison already, but it's already at 400 nature damage per turn. How did that happen? Yeah, fighting Oozeemancers is not fun, but I'm sure playing as it definitely is. I have yet to properly explore this class, but this class is S tier, and likely better than Necromancer. The stats support it, reading through the talents supports it, everyone in the game seems to agree that Oozemancer is one of the best classes, so I'm confident enough to put it into S. Continuing with this trend, there is Paradox Mage, also known as the class that has like 50 different sustains that reduce damage by 30%. This class is basically impossible to kill through damage. If you get debuffed, sure, you will eventually die if you cannot cleanse these debuffs, but damage is not an issue. You get access to Temporal Reprieve, which might be the best defensive talent in the game. It gives you 7+ turns of complete safety, and you can heal up, recharge your inscriptions, rest so that your paradox goes down, just completely stabilize and get back in the fight, while the enemy is just sitting there at 40% life with every single talent already used, wondering how it's supposed to win. Well, it can't. The easiest way to die on Paradox Mage is to get high Paradox and trigger some of the anomalies, which can be decently dangerous, which is why by far the most popular prodigy choice is Hidden Resources, which lets you ignore the anomaly chance on using talents. So defensively, this class is bonkers. To deal damage, you have Attenuate, which executes enemies and deals its damage over time, but it will eventually kill anything, especially because it stacks, which it doesn't say, but it does stack. You also, as a mage, get a range 10 3-turn cooldown beam. You get a wall in Materialized Barrier, just in case all your 30% damage reduction sustains and talents run out or get stripped from you. You just put up a wall. And through Fate Weaving, you can prolong any debuff you want infinitely, more or less. So yeah, Paradox Mage is incredibly powerful and a lot of fun to play. So I'll put it in S. It kind of makes me want to put Necromancer into A, looking at it side by side. So you know what? Yeah, let's put Necromancer into A, because I don't think it quite reaches the power level of these two classes. Possessor we will keep for the end. Psyshot is the more fun gun tinker class, and it not only has a gun, it also uses a mind star in the offhand for a bit of extra mind magic. It has access to Nightmare, which is one of the most powerful trees because of inner demons, which you can use to make bosses just kill themselves. It has Molten Iron Blood, which gives you a lot of all resistance, which is extremely good. And then you use talents like Psyshot to shoot your enemies while also hitting them with your Mind Star. Or then you have Mechanical Arms, which does little damage every turn, but more importantly debuffs enemies it hits to deal less damage, which enables Lucid Shot, which deals very high weapon damage and also makes enemies fight each other, which is only a bonus. Mostly it just does a lot of weapon damage. So if you like a bit of complexity on your gun shoot class, then go for Psyshot. I also think the class is just stronger, so I'll put it next to Annihilator in A tier. Reaver is another dual wielding class, and it's the evil version of it again. So blight damage, acid damage, that's what you should expect. It has access to Bone Shield, it's just an unlocked category. But the interesting unique class tree is Rot, which makes the Reaver into a kind of discount Oozemancer, because when you get hit, you'll take reduced damage and spawn a worm, which do not tank for you, but they are more powerful aggressively through Pestilent Blight. They can apply all kinds of different debuffs, and offensively, Reaver is defined by Corrupted Strength, which gives you free melee attacks when you cast spells, so it's kind of a mage assassin hybrid. And from my admittedly limited experience with the class, it feels pretty similar to Doombringer, in that you deal a lot of damage, but die very quickly. Here you have Bone Shield obviously, but once that's down, you feel very vulnerable, since you have to spend time in melee. I also think Reaver really could have had at least one of these general trees unlocked. It definitely wouldn't make this class like too powerful or anything like that. So I'll put it into C somewhere, let's say right here, just because I really respect Bone Shield. Rogue is a pretty interesting class because there are quite a lot of ways you can take it. You could just play it as a dual wielding melee glass cannon type character, for which you get the assassination tree with Garrote and Marked for Death for some really big burst of damage. But what you can do on Rogue, and no other class, is play Throwing Knives, which Marauder also has Throwing Knives, but only at 1.0 mastery. So if you want to play Throwing Knives, you should play Rogue. And I have heard a lot of good things about full stealth, poison, Throwing Knives Rogue, where you focus on nature damage and just stack it from range, while enemies have a hard time finding you because of your high stealth score. And then you take Mystical Cunning, so that you can poison any enemy. Kind of a mandatory prodigy, I think, for poison builds. And unfortunately, I have not played that build yet, but it sounds really good to me. So despite Rogue being the bottom 2 win rates from the shown data, I am willing to bet Poison Stealth Throwing Knives Rogue is actually quite good, roughly around B tier somewhere. I will be trying it out pretty soon, so if it's bad, I'll update you in the pinned comment. Sawbutcher is one of the Tinker classes, and this one I have played by far the most. It's what I used to get through the second campaign, and it is pretty insanely powerful. Let's start off with Tempest of Metal, which does damage in an AoE around you when you attack, and can give you up to like around 30% chance to just ignore damage. Yeah, that's a pretty decent talent. You also get Grinding Shield and to the arms to reduce any damage that does get to you. Then you can even get some flat damage reduction through the Furnace Tree and Molten Metal. But while it gets weaker the more you get hit, on maximum points it actually converts to a pretty powerful attack through Melting Point and Furnace Vent. And then you even get talents like Spinal Break that reduce the global speed by a lot and remove sustains. Then you also have a Silence, and Tinkers obviously, so Sawbutcher just kind of does it all, and it's without a doubt one of the best melee classes. I've not tried it in the regular campaign yet, but I don't see a reason why this class shouldn't be, at the very least, A tier. Speaking of powerful melee classes, there is Shadowblade, which is a dual-wielding rogue that can also cast magic, and it has perhaps the best talent in the game, Shadow Veil. Or that's at least what I wish was true, because this talent is really fun, but I don't think losing control of your character is ever a good idea, and I think you are just lowering your win rate if you use this talent. Because even though you get all these free resistances and you cannot get debuffed, that's all fine, but all it takes is for you to just make a simple mistake. You know, maybe you use track and you overlook that there are 2 uniques, or there's a unique around the corner that might be able to see you when you randomly teleport and hit this other enemy, or maybe there is one in stealth, or maybe you will just take more damage than you anticipate. Once you click the button, that's it. You have committed to staying around in that combat for 3 turns, and that's just not something I ever want to do. You know, if this dealt like 500% weapon damage, then maybe you could talk about this being a good trade-off. It might even be overpowered at that point, obviously, but like this, I don't think it's worth using. Other than that, Shadowblade steals some of the powerful defenses from Archmage, so you can get Temporal Shield and Phantasmal Shield. You can use Teleport while still having Tumble and Trained reactions, and you get Shadow Feet to regenerate your mana and give you global speed, all in a sustain. But despite all that looking pretty good on paper, Shadowblade is kind of a struggle. I think its by far best offensive talent is Shadow Grasp, which is a range 10, straight from the first point you put into it, grab that also disarms and silences, which basically means it completely ruins every class other than Mind Power casters. So you want to open with this every combat, and if the enemy doesn't cleanse it, you deal a lot of damage, so you can kill it very quickly. That is how you get through most of the game. But then when an enemy either cleanses it or they have a lot of armor, it's just very difficult to deal with. And I'm currently playing a Shadowblade, and I think I'm like level 35, and I've had so many close calls, and it reminded me a lot of playing Sun Paladin, which, well, I don't want to spoil anything, but it's not a good sign. You can reach some really high speed on Shadowblade since you have access to Blinding Speed and Essence of Speed, but it is extremely punishing, and I think definitely one of the more difficult classes to play. So I will put it next to Doombringer in C tier. But now we are back to some of the best classes in the game. I've recently made a video on the Skirmisher and called it the best class for new players, and I stand by that because it is insanely powerful defensively, as it gets flat damage reaction that you can max out by like level 10, which makes for a comfortable leveling up until your first Prodigy, which is usually a really tough part of the game. And then you pick either Bombardment or Cold Shots, and then you just spam those 3, 4, or a single button in the case of Bombardment, and things blow up and die. You have the other tireless combatant talents that give you some regeneration of health, but mainly stamina. So even if you run out, you can just kite for a little bit and get some stamina for a few extra attacks. You get the mobility tree, but you also get the Scoundrel generic tree, which has really good talents like Fumble or Misdirection. So it's just the complete package. Easy to play, extremely powerful offensively and defensively. The only slight downside is that since you don't get many buttons to press, it can feel a bit boring in the mid-game before you start hitting for like a billion damage through your kill shot. But that doesn't knock this class from S tier. In terms of is it better than Paradox Mage and Oozemancer, I'd say it's very similar. It's a weapon class, so it plays quite differently from those. I think you could definitely argue this is the best class in the game. And that's how I originally wanted to sell it. But then I remembered there is another class, Solipsist, which gets Mind Seer at level 1 And leveling with Mindseer feels like cheating a little bit. It just does so much damage, and it's mind damage, which enemies usually don't have resistances to. And Solipsist is incredibly tanky, because Psi, your resource, is basically a second health bar, as a percentage of damage you take gets converted to it, and also reduced before it gets converted. And then Psi also gives you like global speed bonuses, and even saves, which are actually a valid defensive layer on Solipsist, because you get a lot of them for free. And when you get bored of spamming Mindseer, you have some other mind attacks that are decent, but you also get access to Nightmare with Inner Demons, which is a really fun talent, an insanely powerful talent that just creates chaos on the battlefield when you put it on the strongest enemy. Then you even have talents like Mental Shielding, that makes sure you never get affected by any mental debuffs. And you can, and should I think, go anti-magic, so that you can permanently run a regeneration infusion, which heals your health and the Psi, and gives you maximum life, which is really valuable because of all the damage reductions that Solipsist has. And at that point, basically the only real weakness of this class is that in a world where you get bursted insanely hard, your Psi will go really low, and at low Psi, you get penalties, like negative global speed. So, in theory, Solipsist is worse at recovering from these kinds of critical situations than other classes. But I don't think that scenario ever actually happens, so it's not really a problem. So Solipsist, in my opinion, is the best class in the game, from my current experience. Maybe Oozemancer is better, like I said, I've not played it yet, but man, is it hard to beat Solipsist. It's just so good at every aspect of the game. Stone Warden is kind of a secret class. The AI cannot be Stone Warden, so you'll never fight against it in the game. And you can only play it as a Dwarf or Drem. The unique part of this class is that you can dual wield shields on it. And it's a bizarre combination of a Mage and a Warrior and a Wilder class. You have mana and you have Equilibrium. And I have personally played this class exactly once, and after reading through the talents, I have identified the perfect way to build Stone Warden. I have decided to use Stone Vines and Eldritch Vines as my primary damage. So I focused on arcane damage and just wanted to turtle up with the help of talents like Stone Fortress, and it was the worst character I have ever played. Not only did the vines not do damage, they also just didn't do any damage to enemies that were pin immune, since they just couldn't apply to that kind of enemy. So yeah, I don't recommend doing that. But you have a lot of other options. You can go into more of a summoner, when you can split yourself into two halves, which each have their own special talents. Or you can just play as more of a regular weapon class and hit things hard with your shield. It's definitely a pretty confusing class at first glance, but I really want to explore it more because there are some cool possibilities. As for how good it is, I feel the least confident on this out of every other class. So I'll put it into C, next to Cursed, but don't put much weight on this one. Summoner is another one of the starter classes, and it's another one that is a bit of a disaster. It does what it says. You get all kinds of different summons, from a turtle or a wolf to a minotaur or a hydra, and even dragons eventually. And it is not as simple as some of the other classes, with talents like Detonate or Wild Summon that give you different bonuses depending on which summon you use it with. But I think it's a contender with Alchemist for the most boring, mind-numbing class to play. Often the best thing to do is to use all your summons, and then you just go hide around the corner, so you don't even see what's happening, and then you just peek out, see, oh, the enemies still have 50% HP, so you throw out some more summons, leave again, and then just keep doing this until they die eventually. And it doesn't feel particularly powerful, and it makes me want to fall asleep. I don't think the class is actually that bad, because the summons can have some absolutely ridiculous stats, so they scale fine into the late game, and this class actually performs really well in the insane win rates, but yeah, I wouldn't believe that too much. I'm putting Summoner in D. It's been a while since I played it, but when I did, it just was overall a pretty miserable experience. I also knew a lot less about the game back then, so maybe I would do a lot better now, but it simply has to go into D tier, alright? Because I refuse to call Sun Paladin a bottom 3 class. Sun Paladin. This class has some of the coolest talents in the game. It's a melee class where you can either choose to go a two-handed weapon or a sword and shield, and has one of my favorite talents, Path of the Sun, which can be up to 9 range line where movement takes no time, so you can use it to sneak around really tough enemies, something you'll need to do really often, or to close a gap to an enemy and quickly stun it, only to run back into max range and use Wave of Power for massive damage. And now 2 more enemies have appeared, so you rush back in on the Path of the Sun and cast your Flash of the Blade and deal big AoE damage and become invulnerable. But however powerful this might sound on paper, it just doesn't play out too well in practice. To me, Sun Paladin is the most fair class out of all of them. It doesn't really have any huge weaknesses. It can heal a little bit, it has some defense, some decent offensive talents, but nothing really spectacular. And you never reach a point with this class where you feel overpowered. Every unique kill, every boss feels earned. Sun Paladin has the lowest win rate out of all the classes in the 1.74 data, but it also has by far the most games, and I mean, come on. Who has been doing this? Someone is running a targeted operation to make Sun Paladin look worse than it actually is. And I will not stand for it. It almost has 5,000 deaths, and it's definitely not that bad. Sun Paladin also has 2 class evolutions, the Fallen, which makes you into like an Oathbreaker, and Avatar of the Distant Sun, which lets you wield a two-handed weapon and a shield, so that you can utilize both of the trees. And that's what I've always been playing. I always go for Avatar of the Distant Sun. I'm not necessarily sure it's optimal in terms of power, but it's really fun to be able to enjoy both of the unique trees on one character. So I think in reality, Sun Paladin is sort of similar to all these other melee classes. I don't think it belongs in D, but it's definitely on the weaker side. But you should still play it, because I mean it already has 5,000 deaths, so it can't get much worse for Sun Paladin. Temporal Warden is one of the coolest designs of a class I've seen in any game, as it's the only class that can swap between the primary and secondary weapon sets without it taking a turn. And the whole class is built around being able to seamlessly swap between using a bow and melee. And the class has a summoner tree where you can summon dogs, but I think by far the most fun way to play this is to just fully commit to this idea of constantly teleporting around and switching between melee and ranged. And for that you have talents like Threadwalk that either teleport you to melee range if you shoot an arrow, or teleport you to your maximum bow range if you hit in melee. And then there are all kinds of talents that summon Temporal Wardens from different realities to come and help you deal more damage or tank for you. And all these talents are really good already. Temporal Warden really just has a really powerful base kit, but then you combine it with item mods like of the Voidstalker on cloaks that give you this stat that increases resists defense after you teleport, which you will be doing constantly. So you will permanently have this all resistance, which makes you really tanky. So you stack as much of this stat as you can, and Temporal Warden is just really good and really fun. Definitely one of my favorite classes, and I think it's S tier. The class just feels really good to play.
Writhing.
Writhing One is another class that does Alchemist better than Alchemist, although this is a melee class that has a tentacle in its offhand, which allows you to do all kinds of cool attacks, and you can unlock a category that lets you summon a worm that walks, which is a permanent summon, and this guy has heavily reduced damage, but it can get pretty tanky, and you can equip it with all kinds of items, and it can put a lot of debuffs on enemies. It also just gives you a lot of good stats just for existing with Shared Insanity, which just gives you all resistance passively, and you can stun enemies for a really long time in a pretty big AoE. So this part of the class is done really well. And then it's all about the Tentacle, which hits when you attack, but it only uses magic and it does only darkness damage. And it's pretty decent by itself, just when bumping into enemies. But then you can also send it out to constrict enemies, which buffs some of your other attacks, like Tendril's Eruption, which instead of an AoE, becomes a really powerful single target attack. And for the defense you get Shed Skin, which is a pretty big instant speed shield. And then you can grow pustules on your body when you take damage, which give you all resistance. And you can then make them explode on your enemies, covering them in your blood and gore and making them heal you for a part of the damage they deal to you. And you can even summon Devourers and Bloated Horror to just tank for you a little bit. I've not been impressed too much by these summons, so this class is pretty sick. Both of the Forbidden Codes DLC classes are really fun and great designs. But in terms of its power, it feels in line with all the other C-tier melee classes, although I think it's one of the better ones, so I'll put it at the top. And now we get to Vermic, which is the half-dragon, half-man class, on which you can use Dragon Breaths, which are massive AoE attacks, and you get one for each element, and they also either disarm or stun or have some kind of debuff tied to them. And there are two ways you can build Vermic. Either you play it just as a weapon class, in which case it's not that interesting and I would put it somewhere in C, but what I think is way cooler is to just fully focus on the Dragon Breaths and try to play it as more of a caster. And this is possible because of Acidic Spray, which becomes a beam at level 5 and carries you through the early game, because the breaths don't deal a lot of damage and you need to be a higher level to start taking them. Where this build really comes together is when you get higher draconic abilities and you get to Chromatic Fury, which literally doubles the damage of your breath talents because it lets them also scale with willpower. And from that point on, you fully focus on the breaths and play this weapon class as just a pure caster. Also, higher is the best race for that build, and higher passively increases your sight radius. And if you take Adept, you can actually get the breaths to 12 range instead, which is pretty overpowered because basically no enemies can retaliate for at least 2 turns. Defensively, Vermic doesn't really have any damage reduction, but you get lightning speed, which is just an extra movement infusion, so I love this talent. And you get Tornado, which continuously knocks back enemies, which doesn't have much use for in the weapon build, but in the breath build this is very good. And you get Ice Wall, which you can get to almost permanent uptime if you go Adept, and it also even freezes enemies, just as an added bonus. So I think the breath build almost pushes Vermic into B tier, although I'll have to put it in C just because of Cultist of Entropy and these classes, because the early game on Vermic is really bad if you go for the breath build, but I'll put it over Anorithil, just so that it's clear that it's part of these guys and not these guys. And Possessor I kept last because this class is just weird. It doesn't really follow the rules that all the other classes do, and I have not played it yet, so it's basically impossible to judge. From what I hear, it is incredibly powerful if you can get your head wrapped around it, so it might be somewhere in the S tier, but I'm not even going to rank it because it's just kind of pointless. So this is my current tier list. I think with more experience, some of these might belong a tier higher or a tier lower, but as a general guideline, I think this is pretty representative of the strength of these classes. If there's one part I think people will not be happy about, is putting these caster classes in the same tier as these melee classes. And if there was a tier between B and C, I would put these 4 there, because they are actually really good late game, unlike a lot of these melee classes, which are just okay. But the early game is so bad that I think that's what ties all these C tier classes together. So this is my take on it. I hope it was interesting, and thank you for watching.